I had a fatality hit and run of a teenager in my district this morning, and our condolences go out to the family. And it's a tragic incident. Welcome to the Ad Hoc Committee and Community Care Facility. We're going to go into public comment first on the agenda item. And before we start that, once we start public comment, we'll take cards that have already been submitted. If they haven't been submitted, we've already started the discussion. We'll note that the cards were received. With that, it's one agenda item. I wanted to thank my colleagues, Felipe Fuentes, Mike Bonin, for being here this morning as well. Thank you, council members. And we're going to open it up. Do we have any? No,
not at this time,
no,
sir. No
public comment cards. Okay, so we'll go ahead and, since we have a quorum, we'll close the public comment since there are no cards submitted. And with that, we had a first special meeting. This will be a regular standing committee meeting at the beginning of, or the end of last year, or is the beginning of this year. So with that, though, we're going to have, as I see it, the next 3 meetings, just so people are aware, this item, the reports from the city planning, city attorney, Los Angeles Department of Building and Safety, and any other departments related matters, PD, etc., on the history, the codes in California, where we're at today, to recapture the discussion in the opening remarks that occurred at the first special meeting that we had. There was a consensus amongst the committee, and I think also the general public and a lot of the comments that were made as well, that we are starting fresh, that we are looking at this with a blank piece of paper, although we are taking into consideration the history, the discussions. There's been a massive amount of community participation and outreach that led up to this ad hoc committee as well. We're not going to discount all of that. We're going to refresh it, look at it from a different perspective, and set some goals and objectives. And those were crystal clear, certainly in my remarks and others that were shared from the public and the panel, that the idea is to protect housing. The idea is to protect those most vulnerable in society. The ideas are to protect the laws that we have on the books and updated the antiquated ones we have here in the city to reflect those that are in the state of California as well. The ideas are that we protect those facilities and organizations that are offering responsible services and doing so in a responsible manner, and to protect the community as well. Particularly those individuals who are housed in these particular dwellings and facilities that are not checked on, that are most vulnerable in society. And so we want to ensure that we adhere to every and all laws that we have, both federal housing laws, disability rights laws, California laws, and ensure that we protect those folks in those facilities and figure out a way to do that. And that sort of sums that up. Since Councilmember Bonin wasn't available at the last meeting, I'd like him to open up with his thoughts and vision as well as he sees sort of the current issues and objectives of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everybody. I'm glad to be here today. This was the issue of community care facilities ordinance is one that I have a bit of history with. I was a staff member to Mr. Rosendahl when this proposal, the last version of this proposal, was working its way through, and I think in large part I'm here on this committee to help us work through the new way forward, because I had a different perspective on that proposal than a lot of folks. I was noted as an opponent of it. It was an issue of some contention when I was running for office. A lot of the strongest supporters of the proposal are my constituents, some of them here in this room. And I promised folks that while I had a different perspective from them on the ordinance as proposed at the time, that when I got in office, that I would do my best to work with Mr. Englander to try to find a different way forward that addressed the concerns of both those who supported the ordinance and those who opposed the ordinance. And so I was very happy when I got on, and Mr. Englander asked me to serve on this committee with him, because I meant what I said about finding a way forward that works for everybody. So there's some perspectives I bring to this committee. You know, I am very, very well aware of the fact that there are people in Los Angeles who absolutely depend on shared housing. That there are veterans in my district that need to share housing in order to reintegrate into society. That there are senior citizens in my district who must take in boarders in order to continue to meet their mortgage and not lose their home. That there are college students who can't afford to live on the West Side unless they live together. That there are victims of domestic abuse or people who are disabled who depend on shared living. And that it's very important for people who are in their first steps of recovery from addiction to alcohol and narcotics, a phenomenon I know a thing or two about, benefit from shared living, and by the process of shared living get to become productive members of society again and bring benefit to our neighborhoods. But I'm also really well aware of the fact that it is folly to think that all of those good intentions are universal. There are some really bad actors in the city of Los Angeles, and many of them are in my district, in Pacific Palisades and in Mar Vista, two places in particular. There are some rogue sober living operators, and there's a number of them, who are mercenaries, who are preying on people who are trying to get sober, and who are inundating neighborhoods with problems. There are party houses, there are nuisance properties, and we need to find a way to address both of those. This is not, as Mr. Englander and the last council learned, an easy situation. It's complicated by a number of different things, largely some federal law, some that is in place for very good reason, fair housing law, and then there's some regulations that are well-intentioned but complicate things considerably, such as the provision that folks who are using VASH vouchers may need to have their own individual leases. There's things like that complicate our efforts towards a good solution. I do want to say, though, there were some people, I want to be very, very frank about this. There were some people when this committee was formed who expressed alarm to me. What is Mr. Englander doing? Is he trying to bring back his old proposal? And they were concerned. And I want to say very clearly to them that I've spoken with Mr. Englander. I know him very well. We've known each other for over a decade. And I've seen his commitment to doing the right thing. And I am absolutely convinced of his intention of finding a way forward to work with everybody to find an ordinance that works, that focuses on the nuisance properties and the problem properties and does not harm anybody in need of help. I am very, very committed to working with him, and I think his leadership on this issue has been genuine and heartfelt. And I think that his leadership on this committee will help get us to exactly the place we need to be. So I want to thank you for that and underscore my trust of you in this process.
Thank you. Thank you for that opening statement, too. I do appreciate that. And in putting this together, so you know, this is the only ad hoc on the City Council, and it's a one-issue committee. It's a complicated issue. As Councilmember Bonham shared with you. I am committed to do the right thing, which is why one of the many reasons that I asked specifically for Councilmember Bonham to join us on this committee, because I knew his passion to ensure that we do this fairly, openly, and that we protect those most vulnerable in society, and that we figure out a way, if there is a way, to carefully and delicately craft policy that protects those that can't protect themselves, and that we simply don't throw a blanket over this or refresh the old ideas, but come up with a new path to get there. And we have known each other for a long time, and we've worked on a lot of issues together. It's refreshing to have somebody who has that experience and has a different perspective and way to get there. And that's why I thought it would be a good complement to this committee, and to show that we're both genuine in the way that we want to approach this and give everybody a seat at the table. We have a tremendous need in Los Angeles for shared housing, for transitional housing, for disability housing, for senior housing, for sober living, for all of those facilities. But we've got to approach it in a responsible manner. I've seen firsthand on dozens of occasions people living in deplorable conditions and warehoused, and that's not an answer. I've seen it with my family. My sister, who was disabled, and at the time where we couldn't afford much care, and went into an unlicensed facility. It was so horrific when we found out what was occurring there that we took her out, and she moved in with us. We took care of her until she passed away. But I've seen it. I've seen it as a council member. I've seen it as a chief deputy. I've seen it in putting together a task force that I've worked on for over 10 years, working with county probation and building and safety, with senior lead officers, with the community. And it's not right. But rather than just, again, come up with a policy that says we're going to find the path of least resistance, and some people, it'll close some facilities that are reputable, that's not responsible either. And so I know that we can get there with the will, and there's a will. Mr. Fuentes has these issues as well. I don't know the situation that, in terms of the circumstances that happened just 2 days ago in his district, in terms of how this family was housed, and that's all being investigated. But just 2 days ago had a family of 4. And I understand that father was an incredible father and hero, and 2 kids, 12 years old and 9 years old, 7 years old, perished in a fire in deplorable conditions, living in what appeared by news accounts to be makeshift housing. It's no way for people to live. And we've got to look at these. And we all experience these things, whether it's right down the street from us or in our own families. So I thank you for that. With that, there's 3 sections that I want to focus on for the next 3 meetings and do a deep dive into these. Since the CCFO has lengthy history, it's undergone, again, numerous modifications, and we'll be looking at this with a fresh approach. It's important to really understand and get to the details and the definitions of what these various things are. First, for this meeting, we'd like to focus on state licensed community care facilities. So what is a state licensed facility? What does it mean? When did that go into effect? When was the California Community Care Facilities Act established, and why? What's protected and what's not? What are different jurisdictions throughout California doing or required to do to treat licensed community care facilities? So I want to get into that. The next meeting, we'll talk about non-licensed homes operating as quasi-boarding and rooming houses. And so if they're not licensed, and a lot of these facilities don't have the ability to get licensed, and we'll find out why. Why can't they get licensed in California? Is there a roadmap to that? Should they be? Should we have the ability to license or not license? Those are the questions in the detailed look that we'll dive into. And is there a way or a path if we do decide that that's the role we should take? And if we do so, is there a way we can do so in a responsible manner that is feasible for existing facilities that don't have the funds to go through that type of requirement? Is there another way to get there? And what does that mean if that's an option or an opportunity? And then lastly, the third meeting, we'll get into the residents with several parolees, probationers living in a unit. And what does that mean? Particularly with AB 109, early release, monitoring. We'll hear from experts. We're going to bring in panels. We've taken on a whole new role and responsibility as it relates to that, particularly with LAPD. We've spent last year, I believe, upwards of $50 million out of the LAPD budget that was not part of the original budget to monitor and take on a whole new role of monitoring early release or AB 109 prisoners. So what does that mean? Does that have a role into this, or do we bifurcate that and deal with that on a separate track? So those are the things we're going to look at, and since it's complicated, I wanted to dissect it. And I think once we do that, we'll start then getting into some discussions and ideas on, what can we do. We'll also get into, after that, what are the legal obstacles? What's case law done? What have they had happen in other jurisdictions? What can and what abilities do we have? And so I just wanted to share with you a roadmap on just for discussion purposes, and that's what this will be over the course of the next few months.
Mr. Chair, could I suggest an additional stop on that roadmap that I think would be beneficial for us to look at? Part of the sort of, I think a useful lay of the land now would be for us to have a discussion about the city's nuisance abatement and code compliance procedures, so we get an understanding of what the situation is like now. It also helps, I think, one, it gives us a baseline understanding of why the city's current tools aren't working, what it may take to make them work. Also, a number of the folks who were concerned with the last version of the ordinance were calling for more enforcement and compliance, and so I think part of our due diligence would be to examine that as well.
So we'll add that to, what I'll do is we'll add that to another item of nuisance abatement, code enforcement, what works, what doesn't. And we'll have a special meeting just on that.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I think that's a great idea. Great. Okay, with that, we'll, if we could ask the city attorney's office as well as various departments to come up on state licensing community care facilities. Planning and good morning.
Morning.
Good
morning.
Morning.
So if you could just give us as much of a detailed overview as you'd like and as you can on the Community Care Facilities Act of 1973, I believe, and what went into that, what does it state, what's the goals and objectives of that, and any details you could provide. That'd be great.
Sure. Well, good morning, council members. My name is Matt Gillespie. I'm with the Department of City Planning. I'm in our citywide policy section and kind of our housing guy in that unit. Just completed the housing element, and I'm pleased to be sort of the liaison to your committee and to be working with you moving forward, and as well as members of the public on this issue. To begin with the state licensed community care facilities, this is a type of use that was established by the state of California by the Community Care Facilities Act of 1973, so quite a long time ago. I think the basic idea with these types of facilities is that they would be a non-medical, sort of strictly healthcare oriented, more community-based type of facility for persons with special needs that require some services, some sort of supervision, some care, but in a residential setting is really meant to be, I think, the operative word here. There's sort of a healthcare, more institutional-based model. I think the idea is when folks transition out of that, is sort of a middle ground into more of a least restrictive environment. The idea was that these would more generally blend into the residential areas and have minimal kind of health care actually going on, but some level of supervision, some level of care, treatment happening in those facilities. And they're actually broken out into 3 separate sort of facilities that fall under that definition, and that would be these alcohol and drug abuse recovery and treatment facilities. And then just what's called residential care facilities for the elderly. And the third would be just what's generically called community care facilities. And I think those are generally aimed at folks with developmental disabilities. So those 3 are sort of related, but they fall under this rubric. And what's important for local jurisdictions and what the Act did in 1973 is sort of make a differentiation between these facilities with 6 or fewer residents living in that home, that facility, versus 6 or more, 7 or more. And so what it said for 6 or fewer community care facilities that meet the definition of that are licensed by the state, that are inspected routinely by the state, that have to meet some state standards. For 6 or fewer persons or smaller facilities, the Act did require that local jurisdictions have to require those by right, treat them like a family, like any other family in any low-density or single-family zones. And so the city has been complying with that since the Act took effect, kind of without having it codified in our zoning code. And so when these facilities come to us, we've just taken note of the state law and granted and treated them no different than any other family. That's the first part of what the proposed ordinance in January, the latest draft, tried to do, is basically codify that, put those definitions of the alcohol and drug treatment, basically mirror the state definitions on those 3 types of sub-facilities, and make clear that those are to be made available by right in our single family and all of our residential zones.
So when you say that made available by right, if it's 6 or fewer and state licensed is by right, or just 6 or fewer to operate is by right?
6 or fewer and state licensed. All these facilities that have this sort of privilege have to be state licensed to qualify for that.
In any zone? Or
any zone residential
zones? Uses
would be allowed today. So all of our R zones, our C zones.
Okay, and you'd mentioned that's the state requires 24-hour the state requires 24-hour care or supervision in order to obtain a license?
I believe that is a requirement, that there needs to be a 24-hour supervision in those facilities to qualify as a licensed facility.
Okay. And are there regular inspections?
I believe there are. I was just trying to rack my brain if it's 3 years or 5 years, but it is. I believe there's a requirement that every 3 or 5 years that an inspection take place.
Do you know what the process to get state licensed is? There's a lot of, I believe, concern. A lot of folks say they can or can't, or suggest that they can't get licensed for a number of reasons. Why would that be?
I'm aware there are some issues with getting licensure. I'm not prepared to answer that right now, but we could come back with that for you.
Okay. If you can come back with that, that they don't, perhaps what we've heard is meet all the requirements, but they fulfill the necessary roles and are providing a critical service, but they don't necessarily perhaps fall under or fill the requirements of what the state requires. So there's a loophole there. And that's what we've gotten back from feedback from some of the facilities and the operators. I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case or not, and I think that's what we need to figure out. Ms. Brothers, if you can weigh in on that.
Amy Brothers, no. I wanted to just note that it is illegal for places to act like they're licensed when they're not. And there are some bad operators that actually fool the families and the residents into thinking they're licensed, and they offer all the care and services that a licensed facility, or they say they do, offer these services, but in fact they do not. And I think the state and the county have a big problem with those type of operators because in fact it's a danger to the health of those residents that are there when there's not actually a true license. So this is a problem I think we're seeing statewide and countywide, not just citywide. And I became aware of it when county folks came to me and mentioned that. I think this is a whole nother category that we probably didn't discuss much over the last few years, but this is a health and safety issue and an advertising issue. I don't even think we've touched much over the last few years. So that may be something that we can bring up when Mr. Rothman comes in with additional answers as to what does it take to be licensed. Perhaps we can get folks to come in from the county to discuss what they are seeing as a problem with some of these operators who haven't been able to get a license or didn't attempt to get a license because they are actually trying to defraud the families and obtain money for providing services that they're not licensed to provide.
Okay.
I'll just add, I have read, I know that there is, I believe, a requirement of specialized training for that person who's sort of in charge and supervising certain credentials. I've read that may be part of.
If you could.
But we'll be happy to look into.
If you could, for the next meeting, if you can bring a copy for the record.
Sure.
And we could actually get it posted as part of the file of any and all documents pertaining to the actual act and the license requirements, as well as enforcement that might be available from the state or the county as it relates to licensed facilities. Any other, just so we have all that information on file.
Mr. Chair, if I could suggest, it's, I think that would be really helpful if we do have a copy of the statute, but usually it's my impression that, so you'll have the act and then you'll have licensure. And sometimes that is divvied up between different state agencies. And ideally, we're talking only about one state agency that would oversee the licensure and the implementation of the regulations and enforcement. I don't know if it's all sort of in one agency or not, or if some of those powers are deferred to the county. But what I would recommend is that we have an analysis done by the CLA that helps us understand what the statute says, how it is enforced vis-a-vis state, county, and city agencies. At a minimum, the roadmap in terms of sort of, or I shouldn't say roadmap, the flow chart on what it is that we presume is the way these things are licensed and enforced. And I think, the comments were made by Matt at the opening here that the City of Los Angeles has yet to codify sort of the operations of these facilities, and I don't think that we can even begin the conversation until we understand the flow chart on how presumably this works. And I imagine that it's going to be a very disjoined, messy flow chart. There aren't going to be real linkages, and I think that's going to help us sort of understand how to proceed. But what I think is critical in that analysis is understanding what by state statute these organizations have to comply with. I mean, whether it's our belief or practice that there's 24-hour care or 3 or 5 years of inspection, those details are going to be really important for us to understand specifically what the statute mandates agencies, and then we'll see if the agencies are actually complying with the statute, which in my very limited experience isn't always the case, and I think that will at least illuminate where we can step in and hopefully not usurp, maybe where we can step in and further put a fine point on what the City of Los Angeles can actually do. So I hate to add work to the CLA, but I think that's going to be really, really important. And if I could add one thing, as I was listening to this initial panel, in the roadmap, as you called it, the 3-4 items that we're going to sort of talk about, at some point, I think, Mr. Chair, it would be really helpful for me to have the stakeholders, separate aside from sort of the agencies that are involved, but the actual operators. And I don't know how we do that, to have a panel, because I'm sure there's concerns about sort of attribution to issues. But if we could have stakeholders, I don't know if there are associations that are involved in this universe. I imagine that there are referring agencies to help us understand who the providers are, because that perspective, I think, is the only thing that I sort of don't see on the roadmap. Separate and aside from, obviously, public comment, which is going to be important. But, I think we're going to need some real staff analysis on all the enabling legislation and enforcement.
Okay. Thank you. I agree with what Mr. Fuentes said. I think there may be various points in the discussion where that'll be useful to have too. I want to ask for a little bit more specific about what you're saying needs to be licensed under the state law. You said, providing care. That's a very, very vague term, and I'm pretty confident that there's more specifics in the case law and in the record. And the reason I'm asking for specifics on that is I think it's a very important distinction for this discussion. Mr. Englander pointed out how we want to examine along this roadmap why certain facilities don't have licenses, and some of that is maybe they can't afford it or the process is burdensome. In very many cases, it's the fact that what they do is not a licensed activity. I am licensed to drive because the state issues a license for that. I am not licensed to be an elected official because the state doesn't issue a license for that. And many of the facilities in question, if it's, I'll use sober living for an example, they live together, they may have a 12-step meeting together, but they're not providing any professional care. It's mutual support. So I'm very curious about what specifically the state, when it says licensed for providing care, what they're talking about and what they're not talking about, because I think that's a very important guidepost as we go forward.
That is partly in the Health and Safety Code, Section 1505, which says this chapter on licensing does not apply to the following. And in fact, recovery houses or similar facilities providing group living arrangements for persons recovering from alcoholism or drug addiction, where the facility provides no care or supervision, is in fact one of those exempt from licensing requirements. And of course, there are about a dozen other types of facilities, you might say, or living arrangements that are exempt from licensing.
Could you get each of us a copy of that? We probably all want to sort of drill down on it a bit.
In fact, if you can submit one to the committee at the next meeting, or prior to, and then we'll submit it for the meeting as well.
Okay.
So we can put it on the record. I think that's very helpful. I'd like to try to document as much as possible for the record.
Right.
So we can share it with the general public as well.
Absolutely.
And the stakeholders. Then they see exactly what the paper trail and the things we're looking at and discussing are, and particularly as Councilmember Fuentes asked, and we'll add that as well, is having the stakeholders and the operators and dedicate a meeting to them as well, and ask them what do they see their challenges to be, what opportunities would they like, what would they like to see in terms of. I don't think there's an operator, quite frankly, in the city of LA or anywhere in the state of California that is offering a good service, that's a reputable operator, that's trying to do the right thing, that can't get licensed because perhaps they fall into one of those categories. I don't think there's one of them that don't want to go after the bad operators. I don't think that's the case. I don't think there's anybody out there that's offering these services and these facilities because they're in it for the right reasons, that just say, these bad operators, the ones that are just doing it for the money and really don't care about the people or the service they're providing, or they're not really providing a service, or they're cloaking themselves in something that they're not really doing. I think they're all genuine, and that they're not one of them out there from any that I've heard, quite frankly, that have never said to me, let the bad operators operate. It's good for my business because it makes us look. I haven't heard that. I think they're all out there saying, no, we want to shut down the bad facilities. There's no question. Just don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We don't want to get sucked into that whirlpool because we couldn't get licensed, or don't create an unfair burden on us to financially go through, everybody's come up with the easy one, the low-hanging fruit, is to go through a conditional use permit. But that's incredibly expensive, and it's a burden for good operators and most of these are operating good operators from what I've heard and seen. Are the ones that are not licensed can't get licensed because they fall into that category, and that's the one we really need to understand.
And also to the point, there's many of them that don't have operators. The woman who takes in boarders to help pay the mortgage. There's not actually an operator as we think about it in terms of facilities.
Right. And so those are the things we're going to have to dive down into and figure those things out.
Right. I just want to add, there's another consideration is that some of these group homes are not licensed because they really, not only is there not a license for them, but there's really no need for a license. There's just a group living situations where people, not just sober living homes, but they have certain disabilities, they have certain issues, they have certain illnesses where they live in a supportive setting with each other, but they don't necessarily need treatment or 24-hour care. They're just living in a sort of a communal group setting, and they appear like a facility, but in actuality they are not a facility. They are just a group home of some type that's unlicensed, but unlicensed because there is no license. There's nothing to license. They're just supportive of each other.
Yeah.
So it's another consideration.
No, thank you. And so what I was saying is with that easy one, well, we can look at conditional use permits and all these. That's very expensive. And so we're looking at an opportunity and we don't want to cast a wide net where we capture all these other elements in these unlicensed facilities. And just because somebody's unlicensed doesn't mean they're a bad operator. And I think that's got to be said. What we're looking at specifically are the types of operators, just like the one that was in Northridge, where we had a quadruple murder. Here was an individual who claimed that he was renting out parts of his home because he couldn't pay his mortgage. The case was not that. In fact, he had separated hallways. People had to use windows to crawl in and out because there was no entry, and their inside doors were boarded up by him. And they used their windows to gain entry in and out of the facility, out of the home. The place was just beyond deplorable conditions, with urine and feces all over the house, both by the residents and a lot of cats that were living there, both. It was just horrific conditions that was not only a health and safety issue, but a quality of life issue, quite frankly, that was really bad. Whether that attributed to the quadruple murder or not, it just happened to happen at that facility or not, isn't the issue. What we're trying to look at is, those, and there's a lot of those. That's what we're looking at. There's a lot of those types of facilities that are doing it not just to pay their mortgage or bringing in one or two families, but they're actually rebuilding their homes and adding rooms not to code, not safe, and taking advantage of these people, where they're telling them how often they can use the restroom facilities in the home, what hours they are allowed into the restroom or the kitchen, or the fact that, your room doesn't come with a restroom. You have to go outside. There are operators like that all over the city, and those are the ones we're trying to go after. So just want to be clear about that. Okay, so with that, we'll add those elements to it as well. And
one note on that. I think when we do the service providers, we should very clearly make a demarcation between those who are providing licensed facilities and those who aren't, just for the clarity of our own discussion, because it can get easily confused, as we've noted.
Absolutely. Yes, well noted. Great. Okay, those. With that, if you can highlight and just talk about a little more about the zones that we're talking about. With the state licensed facilities, are those only geared towards single-family residents? Does it mention in that multifamily or commercial or any other locations, or is it specific to single-family?
Sorry. Generally, from our research is, the way our zoning code works and the way the state looks at it is, if it's allowed in a single-family zone, it bounces up to all of the zones that allow residential uses. So that would include multifamily and commercial, just doesn't include manufacturing zones. So, yes, so they would be allowed in all zones that we allow single-family homes or any type of residential living.
Okay. And then there was if you could speak to disabilities as well, and that was another point of concern, is that those with 7 or more but are offering housing for those with disabilities, of any type of disability, there seem to be some issues or concern that that we wouldn't be in any type of statute that we would write or updating any codes, we wouldn't be protecting those with disabilities. So if you, perhaps, Ms. Brothers, if you could speak to that.
The state would allow us and encourage us under the Community Care Facilities Act to make some provision for those licensed facilities that serve 7 or more. The City of Los Angeles, with the exception of elder care facilities, has not made or codified a provision for any of these. We do not have these definitions in our municipal code. There was an analysis of fair housing impediments prepared 5 or 6 years ago, specifically concerning the City of Los Angeles. And with regard to the licensed facilities serving 7 and more, it noted that other cities, at the very least, provide a CUP, a conditional use permit procedure. Since we don't have codified definitions or a procedure, we have, by policy, directed these facilities to get a variance, which is a very difficult approval to get, and that was part of the criticism in the report on impediments to fair housing, that we, unlike other cities, have made it so difficult for these facilities serving 7 and more to actually operate legally in the City of Los Angeles, and in particularly in these lower residential zones. So that would be the R1, the R2, the R3. We don't have a provision for them to operate there unless they seek a variance, which is a very difficult standard to meet.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. With that, I think we've got a lot of marching orders. I wanted to let folks know that are here or listening in as well. There was some concern. We received some emails that perhaps they didn't receive the agenda or not. While it's an ad hoc and also only be required to post, as we stated last time, 24 hours in advance, this was actually posted far before that. It was posted on Friday. And so if you're not receiving it and it's for whatever reason not online, and we'll check with the city clerk's office, it should be, you can sign up on Council File Index for an alert, so it'll automatically send you the email. And as well as we get the documents, more as importantly, so you know, as we get these documents, we're going to post them as well as part of the council file, because I want everybody to have access to read and see and ask questions on everything that we're reading and seeing and that's submitted to this committee. We want to do this in a transparent manner, and so and be as fair and reasonable as we possibly can. And so we will post everything as we get it and submit it. Great, excellent. Thank you very much. So with that, unless there's anything else, yes,
I have
please.
one. Actually, here for Matt, and I do have a couple of questions.
I was just going to note that if you wanted us to complete the 7 or more piece, what was sort of in the January proposal, we'd be happy to go into that as well. Sort of the just finish up this discussion of the licensed facilities, just this, so you know what the proposal on the table was.
Submit that as well. That'd be.
I actually
Please,
was going to ask you about that. So I mean, we've talked about 6 or fewer.
Right.
What is 7 or more? I mean, and sort of who has jurisdiction over? I guess everybody has jurisdiction over it. But I mean, in terms from a land use perspective, if it's 7 or more, what is that? It's not a community care facility.
Yep. It actually, we're talking just about community care facilities that are licensed right now.
Right.
And so these are still called community care facilities. They're just larger, so they don't have the special protection or the provision in state law that says cities have to allow them in single family.
Right.
For 7 or more, it's sort of silent and allows cities to place some regulation. And as Amy said, many cities have conditional use permits for 7 or more. The proposal that was put forth in January is actually, and Amy mentioned right now, it's sort of a de facto variance, which is even more sort of difficult
7 or more.
for 7 or more
Okay.
than a conditional use permit would be. So it's a barrier right now for those larger facilities.
And those were for single-family zones, correct?
Those were for
everyone.
any
For every
zone,
zone.
but primarily, we expected them to be used in the lower residential zones where it would be very difficult to get a variance to operate a facility serving 7 or more. So we anticipated they would be used quite much more frequently than what we have right now in the residential zones.
So my questions are sort of from a best practices land use perspective. 6 or fewer in a small lot subdivision, they've got the operators, it sounds to me, that are licensed, 6 or fewer, have the protection of statute to be able to set up a group home in a small lot subdivision. For example, in my district, I've got those, and to me, it seems like a very crowded situation for 6 or fewer, but that's permissible by law today.
Correct.
Yep.
Because they're presumed single-family residentially zoned.
Well, they're allowed in any residential zone. So they're allowed in those small lot subdivisions are usually in higher density zones. But yes,
Right.
they were allowed in single-family homes.
So from a land use perspective, it sounds as if for licensed community care facilities 7 or more, that we have the ability to sort of dictate what the land usage ought to be for those types of facilities. So what are best practices in sort of the land use world? I mean, where would 7 or more be ideal from a land use perspective?
Well,
Commercially, I mean, to me, it sounds more like sort of I don't know if there's a distinction between a group home and a facility, but 7 or more, even 6 sounds like a lot, but 7 or more sounds like maybe now we should be looking in commercially zoned areas or certain type of zoned residential communities that would have sort of the square footage per person. I mean, what are the best practices for 7 or more?
If we can describe what was proposed, what was transmitted, I think actually this is the least controversial portion of what we transmitted, but it'll be an example of what we actually thought of. We proposed having licensed facilities serving 7 or over operate by right as public benefits in any zone in the city, as long as the facility met certain requirements regarding parking, to make sure there's enough parking at the location. There was an occupancy limit of 2 per bedroom, so that would also make sure that the density was appropriate for the zone. There were requirements with regard to lighting.
Noise.
generally protecting the residential nature and character of the property itself and the neighborhood. There's some sort of general, it should look like a home, it should act like a home. It's a sort of landscape.
But I mean,
like
do
a
we get
home,
the
and so-
specifics? I mean, R11 versus R1.5?
The state law required us to allow them also in single-family zones, but we have some leeway. So what we were trying to do is to make it to put some conditions on the larger ones that go into single-family neighborhoods. So we did put on a parking requirement that after a certain number of residents, we would require more parking. But right now, they are going into single-family neighborhoods, even the larger ones. So that is the crux of an issue, is that we are supposed to be allowing them into R1 zones. And right now, we have no regulations for them at all.
I see.
So we don't have a conditional use process for them. We have nothing. What we were proposing in the last round is this public benefit process that Amy was describing, where it was actually much less onerous than a conditional use permit. It was actually by right. You could get one over the counter, but you had to, basically make sure that you were providing the required parking, you were meeting these nuisance requirements, and that you were providing this occupancy restriction that we had proposed of like 2 persons per bedroom.
So I'll take a look at the proposal, and I apologize, I hadn't done that before, so I'll take a look at it so I'm better informed with questions. The last question that I have, though, is just sort of zoom out a little bit, and I'll just simplify the description by calling them group homes. Are there any other types of category of permitted housing in a group home sort of type setting, licensed or unlicensed? And I'll give you an example. In my community where I live, there's a 1-acre property, 10 separate bedrooms. It's serving women, and we've never, all the time I live there, have heard a complaint, and I think they're doing amazing work, whatever it is that they're doing. I happen to know the owner, and I don't believe that he's licensed with the state or anything. It's just a 10-bedroom home on a 1-acre, and it exceeds the 6. Is that a group home, or is that just a property owner who's renting out to a I mean, what are the categories of group homes? Because it seems like we were only talking very narrowly of sort of the community care statute. Are there other types of group homes out there, and are we regulating, enforcing on any of those?
If I could, I'm sorry. What we're going to do is, and what I proposed for that specific reason, is the next meeting will be dedicated to non-licensed homes operating as quasi-boarding and rooming homes. So that's exactly all we're going to talk about at the next meeting is that specific, the 7+ or the non-licensed facilities and what the definitions are. How do you describe those? What kinds of organizations and facilities are out there?
Okay.
How do you classify or define
But
that?
as far as the law in terms of separate and aside from, I guess, health and safety codes and building and safety codes, separate and aside from that, does the law recognize anybody other than community care facilities?
I think you are getting probably to the next phase, but I think the short answer is, are they a family? If they're a functional equivalent of a family,
Okay.
they're not a boarding house or a group home or an apartment house or all these other sort of definitions we have in the zoning code. They are a family and therefore have the right to live in anywhere families are allowed to live. And so it becomes a definition of family.
Interesting.
And that's the discussion I think we're going to carry on to next time, and how we changed our definition of family a few years ago, and what the proposal
And just
was.
so you know, when I grew up, my family wasn't functioning, so I don't know how you sort of... It's a whole other matter. Anyway.
That's why you fit in so well with the council. I had one question. You've referred a few times to the proposal or the report from January.
That is the old proposal that we are stepping away from, but we wanted to show the committee what is the state law, what is in the municipal code, and where were we with regard to this last time,
So you're talking January 2013?
Yeah.
2013.
Okay, all right. I thought I missed something in my inbox. So,
And then, you know what, why don't we do this? Since the next meeting will be for the non-licensed homes operating, those definitions, we'll do a deep dive into that and have a lengthy discussion. If you could bring forth the documents we asked for and then add to it, per Mr. Fuentes' suggestion, I believe I heard, submit the previous 7+, if you will, public benefit draft language, not for consideration, only for historic purpose and discussion, to look at, because it defined what those perhaps are. And I want to be clear, that's not for consideration of this committee. It's simply to look at from a historic perspective, since you were referring to it, so we can get it on the record and look at it.
And the city attorney also mentioned a report, I think you said impediments to fair housing report?
Yes.
That
and
would be
I-
helpful if
Okay.
you could circulate that to all of us too. I don't believe I've seen that.
Fair housing.
It's a report that's required by HUD of every jurisdiction
Oh.
to analyze what any impediments may be to
Yearly
fair
basis?
housing. What's that?
Is it done on a yearly basis?
Biannual? Is it?
I want to say every 5 or 6 years. It's
Okay.
it's not that frequent.
Okay,
Yeah, and then
so if
they-
you could,
yeah.
if you could submit that as well, that'd be great.
Understanding we can probably
Yes.
find out on our own, but thank you if you get it to us.
And if those documents could be submitted to our offices, to the committee offices, all prior to the meeting, but then at the meeting, so we can put them up as part of the record as well.
Chair,
Yes.
the clerk clerk's office.
Can do
so
that.
we can
Right.
make it
We'll submit it to the clerk's office so we can post it, correct? And then we'll pull it down as the general public will as well. Okay. And then lastly, I think we'll go ahead and we'll ask, and we may have to do it by motion, but we'll find out, CLA and city attorney, the analysis that Mr. Fuentes asked for on the flow chart, the statute on CFO from the state, the county, the city, what do they have to comply with in terms of enforcement, what's mandated, what's not, how is it enforced? I believe that's what you wanted to capture.
Yes, just highlighting sort of, the relevant health and safety code, whatever code we reference in that statute.
Okay, so we'll ask the CLA and the city attorney to, I don't know if we could just do that informally out of this committee. I think we'd probably have to do it by motion and council to report that back to this committee. So we'll go ahead and I'll draft, if you'd like, as a chair, a motion and bring that to council and have the council approve that to come back to this committee, at least for that report as well. Any other recommendations? No, with that, no, thank you very much, and thank you all again for attending. Thank you for your for the various departments that were here as well, and the panel. I appreciate that very much. We are adjourned. Thank you.